You're listening to 91.7 FM, WSUW, in Whitewater, Wisconsin. You're listening to Rashkin Report. You're listening to WSUW 91.7 FM, Rashkin Report. This is Yuri Rashkin, and my next guest is Professor David McDonald, Dr. Alice D. Mortenson, Petrovich Distinguished Chair in Russian History at UW Madison. Dr. McDonald, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you. You can call me David, and the most distinguished thing about me is my title. The rest is pretty run-of-the-mill.
You also have a very distinguished voice.
Well, thank you.
All right, David. Well, you are a specialist in Russian history, and we're now coming up on a 100-year anniversary almost of that famous 1917 revolution in Russia that seemed to have changed things quite a bit, and yet sometimes it seems like the more things change, the more they stay the same. What are your thoughts now that Russia is approaching 100 years since communist revolution?
The way you put it is a very interesting characterization, because I think that what we would say now is, I think historians would tend to emphasize that there were two revolutions in 1917. One that overthrew the autocracy coming out of World War I, and the other would be the eventual seizure of power by the Bolsheviki in October, November, depending on your calendar. And that really wasn't a sure thing until the Bolsheviks had prevailed in a brutal civil war that really doesn't end until, depending where you are, early 1921 or somewhere, say in the frontiers of the old empire, the new Soviet state, in the 1923-24. So the revolution, in retrospect, it's something. It's like Joe and Lai said about the French Revolution. We still don't know how it's turned out. But I think when I was taking Russian history and political science in the 1970s in Canada, or down here in the States in the 1980s, we always looked at 1917 as a rupture, as this moment, this watershed between a necrotic, decadent, old imperial order that just couldn't do anything right, and this audacious Promethean Bolshevik state that felt that they had history and a place to stand on, and they were going to move Russian society into modernity. And we saw them as really a strong departure from autocracy in many ways, although as the years have gone on, we have tended to move away from that evaluation, especially since 1991, right?
Right.
Before 1991, we were trying to explain the existence of this Soviet state and its phenomenal success in certain respects when seen from outside. And you could point to electrification or urbanization, the development after a certain fashion of industrial economy. On the other hand, and also their success in World War II, in contrast, their seeming failure in World War I. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, or the unraveling of the Soviet Union, historians have had increasingly to evaluate what they think was the nature of the split, what didn't. For instance, we know now, partly because of better archival access, partly because of our own point of view of the end of history always seems to dictate how we think about the precursors. Now we're starting to see veins of continuity beyond the obvious ones. Like I could spend 3 hours telling you how the Soviets and the post-Soviets, the generation that's in power now, have shown a remarkable affinity or attachment to a particular form of statehood, statecraft, the state's purpose, its relationship to society, its mobilizational and directorial role. We can trace that back to Peter the Great or the 17th century, if not before. But saying that just makes that it makes it some sort of essential attribute of Russian character. How do you demonstrate the continuities? Well, you can do it in several ways. One is that we often forget that the Russian state and the Soviet state that sprang from it shared a common ancestor conceptually with the Kingdom of Prussia, with the Austrian Empire, with several other states in the Germanys, the Old Holy Roman Empire from the 17th century. And indeed, forms of that approach to statecraft persist in parts of Europe that we think are normal, quote unquote, as opposed to the Soviet state or Russia. They persist until, well, one can argue until 1945 with the destruction of Nazi Germany, which practiced a similarly centralized, historicistic, mobilizational version of statecraft, mind you, with the added features of racist genocide and eugenics, whereas the Soviets, one could say, only practiced a frank policy of class warfare. And both state orders certainly went beyond any moral bounds that would have been anticipated by their imperial predecessor. Nonetheless, saying that there's some sort of continuity, you still have to decide what are the mechanisms. And in both cases, you can see, say in Russia, in Soviet Russia, you know who the Spetsy were, right? All these, whether it's the command corps, a lot of the commanders in the Red Army during the Civil War, whether it's the technical specialists that help with the setting up of a new industrial economy, or even the physical plant of the economy that made the 5-year plan. A lot of that was were factories and plants that were inherited from the 1890s and early 1900s. So it seems on one hand that I'm making a case for continuity. On the other hand, the Soviet Union really represented a strong departure with its with its leaders' single-minded dedication to using their power to create a certain style of modernity, as my friends would say, to consciously fashion a certain type of society, a certain type of new human being, and a society that would be an answer and an approach not just to the decadent practices of Tsarism, as they would say, but also to the contemporary capitalist states that had tried to make it a pariah and tried, from the point of view of Soviet leaders, and not just Stalin, had tried during the Civil War and after that to somehow stifle or strangle the new regime in its cradle. So there is a great sense of break and rupture when you listen to Stalin's speeches, when you read Lenin, or read a lot of the early Soviet founding fathers, as it were. They are always positioning themselves vis-a-vis the old regime. And
absolutely. They're always different. That's what revolution is all about, is that you're out with the old, in with the new. But when you refer to Russian stagecraft, which I think is great, how do they then, is this a unique Russian desire to have a strong leader, or is this a combination of circumstances?
I think it's a combination of several circumstances. I'll trot out before you a theory I have, is that it's a confluence of several factors. One is the nature of of going back to the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, the understanding of rule that springs out of the unification of the set of disparate principalities that had emerged from under Mongol rule in the when the Principality of Moscow is what
this is like what 1500s
would be. Well, yeah, I'd say from the mid 14th to the mid 16th centuries. Okay. From Ivan Kalita up to Ivan the Terrible, Ivan the Third, Ivan Vasily Ivanich, and Ivan the Terrible. But a sense that, and in this way, not very unlike Spain in the same period. They see them that because of some rhetorical moves the church makes, they see themselves as recreating or reconstituting some holy Russia that had been profanated by the Mongols. Which is itself an interesting retelling. But the Spanish monarchy had the same mission with the Reconquista against the Moors, right? And expelling the Moors and at the same time the Jews by the end of the 15th century. So you had that, which had also become a justification for a certain type of autocratic rule on the part of the dynasty.
But it never had a kind of a democratic tradition that could blossom. There was this short moment that you refer to in 1917 in February, the first revolution before the October Revolution, where there was a short 6 months of sort of democracy, and that collapsed into October Revolution.
Well, it's a hard thing to talk about in brief form because you have to make the Russians sound perverse in that. And actually, there are ways in which it makes sense. Okay, let's talk about February and the failure of the democratic experiment. You had a country that was coming through 3 years of total warfare.
World War One, right?
World War One. World War One that had taxed the entire state, the entire society, not just in terms of taxes. For instance, when they start the war, one of the first things the imperial government does at the insistence with the strong support of Nicholas II, is they impose prohibition on alcohol, right? Which deprives them of a good 20-25% of their annual revenues. They've got this is a state that has gone through a major revolution that most people don't know about in 1905. Came within a hair's breadth of overthrowing the autocracy. Inflicted huge damage on the governing state because a lot of more modernizing bureaucrats lost faith in the project, largely because of Nicholas II, but also shattered a lot of myths that had held the system together, particularly in the countryside among a peasantry that composed 85% of the population. So when they go into the war, it's what we know now is we used to feel that the declaration of war was greeted by this short flush of patriotic ardor. It turns out now that the sustained effort in support of the war extended much longer. But what happens is that by late 1916, the economy is exhausted. Nicholas II has put himself at the head of an army that is sustaining defeat after defeat to superior German forces on the Eastern Front, in a very mobile front, so mobile that you were seeing the displacement of millions of refugees into the Tsarist hinterland, right? A hinterland that itself is short on food, that is poorly equipped with living space, and that sort of. And who are these refugees? A lot of Jewish subjects of the empire who had undergone generations of systematic anti-Semitism. People in places on the Volga and that had never seen a Jew before in their life. And their only concept were these sort of stereotypes that they were seeing in the right-wing press or hearing in everyday conversation. Now, all of a sudden, these very foreign-looking people are in their midst, or Latvians, or a lot of German-speaking subjects, Mennonites and Stundists, and that coming up again from zones of occupation in the east. And they were evacuated from there, either driven out by German troops or expelled by Tsarist troops who had martial law over that zone and saw these people as enemy aliens and sent them back. So you get disruption in the rear. You've got poor transportation. You've got you're getting an okay supply of ammunition and the rest of it. Not as bad as is often said in our literature, but still not enough to contend with the German army. And you're doing it in a post-revolutionary environment where you've got, ironically, more freedom, public freedom of expression in Russia than you have in a lot of the other combatant powers. If you read the minutes from the Duma, the Imperial Representative Assembly that came out in 1905, you can see deputies accusing statesmen, representatives of the government, of treason in a public forum and publishing them. So it's really fall of 16 on, we start to see worker discontent, peasant disaffection, the army starting to fall apart with desertions, with the failure of the Brusilov offensive in the summer, and the rise, how can I put it, the crescendo of the Rasputin thing, right? And it's at that point you've got a society that is starting to fall apart on a bunch of fault lines. And this is what sets up the situation to throw out Nicholas II amid rising prices and food shortages in Petrograd in February. The demonstration starts on International Women's Day, of all things, our March 8th. And the Tsar, being isolated from events, he's out of the front, being more or less obliged to abdicate. And so the group that comes to power, as you suggested, believe in the rule of law, as they'd say at the time. They believe in a liberal constitutional democracy. Well, how do you impose democracy, or how do you establish democracy in a society that is falling apart, that is stretched to its limits of endurance, and is still fighting a war that the new government feels obliged to continue, because it's the only way they'll get the money to support themselves.
So you're saying that the temporary government, the Временное правительство, was more of a vitamin to somebody who has a plague. The situation was so much worse than that. Freedom itself doesn't fix things.
Freedom itself doesn't fix things. Law doesn't mean anything if people don't honor it and behave according to it and believe in it and trust it. Right? There's a really important word that is much on people's lips at the time, doverие, trust or confidence, right? But
it's also if the law is enforced.
But you think in a society that the liberals were idealizing, a rule of law society, laws were enforced, and laws had been enforced for centuries, and in relative terms, enforced pretty rigorously, but depended on civic doverие, on civic trust. And this, why the liberals had a certain type of dream. Liberals, because they believed in the rule of law, in laws being greater than individuals. And they also saw themselves, as you say correctly in Russian, a temporary government. We say provisional. They felt unable to make any sort of disposition about what the state would look like until they had a democratically elected constituent assembly. Elections take place in the fall of 1917, and the assembly meets for about 10 minutes in 1918. It's interesting, the Bolsheviks are quite well represented in this assembly, but by far the largest party are the so-called socialist revolutionaries, sort of peasant Democrats or peasant progressive or populists. And the existence of Constituent Assembly, as Lenin said, by then the Bolsheviki had Petrograd, most of the big cities, Moscow, and he says, well, this isn't a talking shop. Revolutions aren't about talking shops. And he has Red Guard shut it down, right? And the Bolsheviks, and nobody wanted law if it meant continuing the war, if it meant continuing irresolution of what people called the land question. Were peasants finally going to have enough land? And that's something that historians have started revisiting. Of the nationalities issue, what were you going to do? People down in Little Russia were talking about being Ukrainian. Bundists were talking about some sort of Jewish republic. The Latvians and the Estonians couldn't decide whether they wanted to be Bolsheviks or national states. Finland, right? Let alone the Caucasus. So it was certainly Americans and Brits of the time saw it as a great shining hope to finally have democratic Republican government in Russia. But the circumstances, not unlike 1991 in some ways, that how do you get people who don't trust anything to trust something they don't know?
You're listening to WSUW 91.7 FM, The Edge in Whitewater. This is Yuri Rashkin with Rashkin Report, and my guest is David McDonald, Alice P. Mortenson, Petrovich Distinguished Chair in Russian History at UW Madison Department of History. Our conversation somehow started and seems to be centering on whether we're observing continuity of Russian history or perhaps a series of ruptures. And as I'm listening to you, David, I keep seeing parallels really between what was happening as Russia was approaching 1917 with its revolutions and what we're seeing perhaps now, where, we do have a country that is in the midst of several wars. Maybe they're kind of hybrid wars and they're not 100% total warfare like World War I was, because Putin seems to be so much more practical about these things.
Mm-hmm.
But, and he's keeping the price of alcohol, I understand, very low as well. So he's not making that mistake. But there's a certain hollowing out of society, and people are getting poorer in general. The society has to be crumbling.
Well, I think what's different now, like the Putin is hard for me to deal with, because we think of him as sort of this, we think of him as a new autocrat, whereas I think what keeps him in authority is a complex constituency, or a set of constituencies that represent a bunch of separate interests. He unquestionably has a lot of authority. He also has, even if the polls are exaggerated, he has a pretty powerful popularity, certainly outside.
Supposedly 85, 86%.
Yeah. Well, even if it's 75, I can think of 8 Republican candidates and 2 Democratic candidates in this country would kill literally for those numbers. And so there's that is a problem. They've also, this is a population that has lived through the Soviet Union. And so on one hand, there's this very ambivalent relationship to Savoy and to the sort of Soviet decadence, but in some ways it's got a Hamish, like it's something you knew and feel a nostalgia for, but in a very low key sense. And they also remember the 90s, and the 90s were for them just they called bardak. It was just sort of it
was a mess. Right.
But they also remember something that any Russian would agree on, and any post-Soviet would agree on. I've seen it in Astana. I've seen it in other parts, even in certain sense in Ukraine, is the Great War of the Fatherland and the triumph and the sacrifice. They are so, most of that population, most Russians are so organically connected to the victory that, and so we.
You mean the World War II?
Exactly. Yeah. And so there is an example, like, if nothing else in the 20th century, and there's like even President Putin talks about, you will hear him say pretty disparaging things about the Bolsheviks, right down to when he's talking about World War I, the Bolsheviks, sometimes it's liberals, stabbed the imperial regime in the back, that the imperial regime was on the verge of victory, and they were...
You're absolutely right, and that is really, I'm not sure if it's ironic or hilarious, because Putin is very critical of the Bolsheviks.
Oh, sure.
In fact, he specifically, a few days ago, he came out with kind of these, by the way, remarks where he was very critical of Lenin.
Yeah. Oh, no, I that's exactly what I had in mind. And he's done that repeatedly over the years. But also look at how they celebrate the victory last May. And that is just such a definitive national moment. It's a one moment you can point to from Soviet history that the whole country drew together, nation, narod and государство, nation and state, or people and state, were together in defending Mать Родина, the motherland, or our Russia, right? And our Russia, maybe Soviet Union, but really our Russia. And so with the economy in that, as you know, one of the appeals they're making, and they don't appeal in 1917. That's what's going to be interesting next year, is how do they play with 1917? Right now, one of the messages is, sure, there are sanctions. It's the arbitrariness, or it's the selective memory of Western powers, their false sense of a parity that's leading to do this, and it shows how different Russia is from the West. And look, it's nice to have Edam cheese, and it's nice to have Bordeaux and Italian and Spanish ham, but think what your fathers and mothers and uncles and grandparents and aunts went through in the Great War of the Fatherland, and they ultimately prevailed. Do you really not want to live up to that bequest? Do you really want?
Right, but to be fair, that war was used for decades as an explanation or an excuse why things were not going well. Now, people would point at West Germany and go, if they lost, what happened? They're living so much better.
Oh, there's never a single memory, right? That any memory, depending on the moment, can evoke a different set of associations. But I don't know, you get out into...
But it is a singular fact that it does unite people in general. That makes sense.
Sure, and it's something that's a touchstone, right?
Absolutely.
It's like no matter what the differences are between contemporary American politicians, all of them will point to, let's see, the founding fathers, the Revolution against tyrannical Britain. I'm Canadian, so I find this comical, especially in the 18th century context. They'll point at World War II for Americans, right? These are all touchstone shared experiences, whatever.
Although it's interesting that the further Russia moves away from that time period and the fewer people are still alive that had anything to do with it, the bigger the celebrations are getting.
I agree. And that's... I have no way of explaining that. I suppose if I were a nickel psychologist, I would say it becomes a surrogate, fills all these other gaps, and it becomes an explanation because there you can say, well, the West, and it's quite true, the West never recognized the Soviet role in defeating the Nazis. The West never paid proper attention to, like even the non-appearance of representatives of the governments of Great Britain, the United States, France, at this solid, like who shows up in Moscow last May? I think it's the Chinese government. I don't know if the North Korean train made it in time, but it's this pretty desultory group of representatives. None of the old allies show up. But
at the same time, I don't think they didn't show up because they didn't acknowledge part of that Russia played in World War II. It's because they disagree with Putin.
I agree. Well, I totally agree. But it opened. But to a Russian audience, you can say, oh, well, they're trying to politicize something as epical and something as transcendent as this victory, right? So all I'm saying is that, to get back to your original question, 1917's legacy, interestingly urbanized society that goes through forced urbanization in about a generation and a half, which has certain implications for what rural Russia is like and how agriculture works, or rural Soviet Union, and has real implications for urban culture. The huge effort to reconstitute an intellectual and artistic elite, given the huge losses that people now acknowledge as a result of the Bolshevik seizure of power. What was involved in giving literacy to a huge population, but also the creation of an acceptably or of a very broad sphere of acceptable violence, or quote unquote legitimate political violence. Yeah, terror, exactly. Collectivization, the deportation of certain ethnic populations, Chechens, Germans, but also after the war, an increasingly, although sporadically, sanctioned anti-Semitism, right? The Doctor's Plot, the early 50s, but also the Refusniki of the 60s and 70s, whether it's Sinyavsky and Daniil, the Refusniki of what becomes the third wave, and more of an attempt to play on sort of older political languages.
All right. David, how do you view in this context, Putin himself? Because I'm trying to be kind of in a more tolerant way. I could say that he maybe is better than Stalin because he seems to be more concerned about money than just power for power's sake.
Yep.
He doesn't seem to be in general supporting any sort of divisions in society based on nationalities. That doesn't seem to matter so much to him. There's at least no anti-Semitism in Putin's Russia.
No, not when you see his coterie, no.
Right. With his best friends, the fellow, oligarchs, several of them are Jewish, and
yep.
And that's
the
it seems unusual.
Yeah, I agree, and that's striking, and I think that's part of his. When you read what he has to say about Lenin and the Bolsheviki, and there's a certain contempt there for they cashed in a great state for the sake of ideology. To that extent, there is a certain type of old school conservatism to the man that the Bolsheviki were it's strange using Edmund Burke in conjunction with Putin, but that they were sort of abstract and they had no regard for real utility because they were so dedicated to this ideology.
And Putin doesn't have to have that. He doesn't seem to have that burden of ideology.
No. I think that's what makes this this new configuration of power very interesting. Is that ideology? Sure, there was corruption. Sure, the old regime was the Soviets were a bit of a kleptocracy. The Nachalstvo, the sort of those in power, they had their own clinics and they got to go abroad and they got access to certain luxury goods, but they were not very self-indulgent. Like if you saw Brezhnev's dacha or hunting lodge, that would make him a lower-level millionaire in the United States. Whereas,
but those were the rules of the system.
Exactly, those were the rules of the system. And what brought the system down was it couldn't. One of the things that was brought down by many things, but one of them was they couldn't make a financial go of it. I've always had this vision of trying to explain to myself between Gorbachev's generation and Brezhnev's generation. I have this vision of them. Gorbachev gets into the Moscow ranks in about 82, 83. And I can see them standing up on Lenin's mausoleum on November 7th, say 1983, Revolution Day. And these tanks and everything rolling by on Red Square and the missiles and the army formations and the Dobrovoytsi, right, for whom it was sort of black holiday. And Brezhnev is looking out there, and he's from where? Yuzov, he's from Donbass, came of age just before World War II, got his teeth and survives. Right?
There's about a 30-year difference between Brezhnev and Gorbachev?
Yeah, easily. And Brezhnev, as we know from his limitless collected works, was involved in World War II, and Gorbachev is a child really of the post-war. He goes to, his grandparents would be Kulakized, and but he goes to school. He goes to Moscow State University in '53 or that, and he's sort of in economics. His experience of the war is as a kid, not as a combatant. And so then Brezhnev's looking out and he's saying, "Wow, look what we've done," and he's thinking back to the 1920s. Isn't this incredible? And Nixon and Carter and Reagan, they all tremble in their boots just looking at this might. And Gorbachev's looking out and saying, what a mess. Nothing works. There are no spare parts. We can't feed these soldiers. We've barely seen goods out in the countryside. The black market's raging. Like he had a different set of standards. And with Putin, it's, Gorbachev sort of chased certain things. And they were illusory. How do we know they were illusory? Because he couldn't handle power when he was challenged. And then what came after him was the mess that was the 90s. And so there's, and in fairness, having first been in the Soviet Union in 1975, I'd have to say that even now, and now isn't as good from our point of view as it was 10 years ago, there is still much more permissible public expression when you go on the internet, way more than you ever would have seen in the old Soviet. You see things on the internet that you would have had to be in somebody's kitchen to hear and not be repeated outside that kitchen in 1975.
I couldn't agree with you more, and yet sometimes observing the situation from the outside, it seems like the difference between Soviet Union and today's Russia is a couple of switches that would need to be flipped off. One radio station shut down, one TV channel on the internet shut down. You just allow reliable people to use the internet, you're done.
I would not exclude that possibility. And that's one thing. That's one thing. Not being a native really precludes me from making guesses about, right? And when my colleagues in other social sciences and that make guesses, I'm sort of wary because you don't know.
Right.
Although my hunch is several things. One is the new state order depends on active interaction with some sort of economic, with some sort of source of revenue from outside the realm, right? Now, they bet on China, and they're selling China commodity right now that is collapsing in value. As a Western Canadian, I know what it means to have oil prices collapse. But And I don't think it's a happy choice for them, but I think that's happening. But I think they recognize that they've got to be part of world markets in order to maintain. There's other types of power than simply military power, but there is military power. I think another thing is they need the technical, or they need the intellectual class, the intelligentsia.
Do they?
Simply, beg your pardon?
Do they really? Because it seems like I think they're even talking about shutting down their MIT version, Skolkovo, because there's just no money. And it seems like I see so many Russian names participating in sciences in English because they're working for Google or, they're all over, but they're not in Russia.
Where I'd watch in that is the Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology. Skolkovo is sort of a state-directed attempt to try and replicate Silicon Valley.
Okay.
And I hate to say it's very Russian. It's like when you look at the industrialization of Russia in the 1890s, the idea is, well, we've seen how it happened spontaneously in Great Britain, and it was very inefficient. The Germans sort of got it, but now that we know how you do it, we can use the state to direct it across up the right path, right? This is Sergei Witte. And you see a similar attempt in the 5-year plans and the planned economy. Then, of course, so many inputs and outputs that are undreamed of. And with Skolkovo, it was the same thing. We can use state power and state resources and investment to foster something. But of course, Silicon Valley is probably the hotbed of libertarianism in this country. And these people all fancy themselves, what's his name, Galt out of Atlas Shrugged. And
they're all totally self-made.
Yeah, well, they think they're all totally self-made. Yeah. And to now compared to Skolkovo, they are in the idea, and so, but it's a very sort of traditional reflex in Russian politics to these elites that you can instrumentalize them and direct them to state priorities, but it still entails a certain relationship. I think they're very aware of the brain drain. And I think they sort of even care about professions like mine, but they've got a much more ambivalent relationship to us, like political leaders here.
All right. You're listening to WSUW 91.7 FM. This is Yuri Rashkin, and you're listening to Rashkin Report. My guest is David McDonald, a history professor at UW Madison and specialist on Russia. Just recently, we saw that the presidential elections in the United States are taking off, and there's Iowa caucuses, primaries all over the place. Which, from your perspective, which party do you think is likely to have a better relationship with Russia, and what does that even mean?
Both are good questions. I don't know. It depends on what you. I was a big supporter of President Obama, although I didn't have a vote, so I could do that vicariously. I was not a big supporter of the manner in which they approached Russia. I think one mistake that administrations of both persuasions made from the late 1980s on was to lecture Russian leaders, to tell them how they should do things, to presume that and also to cultivate among the sort of the liberal intelligentsia who had a pretty instrumental role in the first few governments, to try and cultivate the notion that if you pass the right laws, democracy and rule of law would take root. And if you did everything through Moscow, the rest of the country would follow suit. And it was very government-centered. It was very miniature. It was sort of telling them what they should and shouldn't do. And if they were treating post-Soviet Russia as if it was a defeated power, and a lot of Russians didn't feel they were. And,
it almost makes me think of like a franchise, like McDonald's. They come in and they tell you that this is how to run a country.
Exactly.
And if you do this, you're going to have burgers, you're going to have customers, it's going to be fine.
Oh, sure. Well, there was my favorite one from the 90s is the crash therapy, Jeffrey Sachs, right? That you've got to marketize by doing that. And, like the way they tried to privatize. Remember Triple M and all these companies that would buy up everybody's their shares and that. And of course, people knew what markets were. There was a thriving black market. Collective farmers, they sold huge amounts of produce and meat and everything on the kolkhoz, on the collective farm markets you'd see in any Soviet town. So it wasn't market knowledge. It was having faith in a legally regulated or controlled public market of certain large goods, right? And so we would lecture them, do it this way. And of course, you spent some time in Soviet society. Who outside of your circle did you or your parents or your friends trust?
Nobody,
Nobody.
Really.
Yeah, right. Whereas,
They hardly trusted their friends because you never know who's going to write something to police.
And I don't know whether it's because, my own speculation is that when you urbanize a certain type of peasantry or rural population really quickly in the conditions of the 1930s, it's not a circumstance to engender trust, right? When there's hardly any goods, when you get rumors, because a lot of these people do not suffer from the terror, but you hear about it and you read about it, and you know how people are turning. Your kitchen was a safe place, right?
Right.
That's still at the table. How do you convince people? And they've got their own view of nachalstvo, right? Of the bosses. There's a moral gap between nashi and yichnia, right? Us and them. And they get to be nachalstvo, but they're exposed to all the risk. We know how to live. We've got our blip, and we can, if I need something, I know who to call, or I know who to get hold of. And so how do you tell a population like this that they've got to trust? They got to trust some stockbroker. They got to trust some judge. They've got to trust some mayor, right? When they all know how these people got put into power. They're all stavleniki. They're all appointees by. That's another legacy of Soviet power. Is there is tremendously little trust, or at worst, there's a tremendous passivity and lack of engagement towards towards
any state. I think it's Zhvaniatsky who says we don't trust. Somebody comes and says, "Trust me, I'm from the government," and the response is, "We don't trust you because you're from the government."
Yeah. Or just it's not my business. I'm not interested. Right? I just want to get my daily bread. I want to watch my soccer, my hockey, see my movies.
It's a good life.
Yeah. Well, it's predictable, and there's no surprises, because most surprises in most lives, there are a lot of surprises when they're political. They're never very pleasant, and so building up trust in this population and going in and saying, okay, here's how a constitution looks like. Set this up, and once you've got your checks and balances and this and that, then it's all going to be. They're going to be just like us. You're going to be normal.
And both Republicans and Democrats have done this to Russia and Ukraine.
So, you look at the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, and then the Clinton administration, and Jeffrey Sachs, and say, crash, what is it, shock therapy, privatizing big shock, and a market established itself. Well, shock therapy worked very well in Poland, but Poland had an infrastructure that had largely been developed in the mid-interwar period. Poland had never collectivized. They tried and it didn't work. Agriculture. Poland had a huge expatriate, huge diaspora that sent lots and lots of hard currency. And when you were telling Poles, you're going to have to take the hit, for a couple of years, because we've got to reorient the economy. Well, smaller economy, probably more balanced, more internally integrated, because of the transportation infrastructure. And anything that happened, you could say, we're doing it to them, the Vrone, right? The Crows, those people, the Muscovites. We're doing it to those goddamn Russians. And so you could unite them around a common. You couldn't do that with post-Soviet society. It was huge, diffuse. The economy had been, they artificially developed certain areas. Think of Norilsk, or think of, Bam, out in Siberia, Kuzbas, or they split up the economy. I always remember their cigarettes after that earthquake in Armenia. My Russian friends complained that you couldn't find cigarettes because sort of the main part of the cigarette was built one place, but filters, that was Armenians.
And that's a very typical approach that they had to Russian planning, is they would take all these parts and factories and throw them all over the country.
Exactly.
And in a way, you can say that it supports economy. On the other hand, it's terribly ineffective.
And by from the point of view of the planners, it created this sense of mutual independence. It would be a school for creating Soviet loyalty, right? But what do you? A, it's diffuse. B, it's hugely large, and we knew the old Soviet economy was dogged by protracted, by these bottlenecks as they euphemized them. And C, who are you going to mobilize against? You're going to mobilize against Poles? Well, they're not doing anything to us. Like, who's doing anything to us? Corrupt people upstairs are doing things to us. That there was no way you were going to get to work. And so the most discredited people, even now, I think, in post-Soviet the current Russian politics, would be all the guys in the 90s, Gaidar and all the people that oversaw the privatization.
Right, the so-called liberals, because there's a theory that, they were allowed to do all these things, and so that later they could be blamed for doing them. And I don't know, it's hard to say because it's, who's to say? Everyone's got their different perspective. But to go back to the relations between the United States and in Russia, what would you have done, suggested that the United States done in 91, or perhaps should be doing differently now? Granted, hindsight is 2020.
There's a lot of things, and hindsight is 2020, and I'm not a diplomat, but for one thing, if I pursued initiatives to aid a developing Soviet economy, something I say in speeches when I first came to Wisconsin in the late 80s all the time, you want to help this country develop its rural infrastructure. This country's biggest problem has always been food supply. What brought it down in World War I, almost killed it in World War II, and played a big part when the economy collapsed in the 1980s. There's an incredible amount of. I would have provided got companies like Cargill and that to build these huge inland terminals, these grain storage facilities. I would have got a rational system for storing and distributing grain and other foodstuffs.
So are you talking about the interstate or cross-country highway freeway system, or are you talking about the storage?
Rails, but I would have encouraged the development of a decent highway system, at least Peter to Moscow, Moscow to Nizhny, Moscow Kiev, Moscow down out to Saratov and that. But and nobody paid attention to any of that. Agriculture, who knows what's happening? And
the sad thing is that they didn't pay attention to people who are far more influential and had theoretically lots of more money to invest, and they weren't necessarily listened to either. You're probably in a good company.
So that's one thing. Secondly, diplomatically, I would have. There were things that were inevitable, like the expansion of NATO. It was tough because the Baltic states, Poland, Hungary, they all wanted in, and they had an understandable anxiety about revanchism, right?
Right. You don't want to sit next to Russia because, well, look at Ukraine, and that's just proving them right.
Well, it is in an interesting way, although we should also recognize we thought we could lay down all the rules, like even with what went on with Crimea and Ukraine, saying this isn't the 19th century. How do we get safe, right? It's whatever century. This is an area in which we don't have a vital interest, there or not, and they do. And there are reasons they feel they have, and we might not take them seriously, but that's what we're dealing with. And our biggest thing is we've always moralized this relationship with. We have no compunction about doing business with China. A state that is probably more cold-blooded than anything that President Putin, more cold-blooded towards dissent, more exploitive of its workers, more predatory, more harassive of its neighbors. Think of the current restrictions over those.
So is it a matter that they are better, more efficient, Chinese are more efficient workers, or do you feel it's a matter that China has better respect for private property than Russia?
I think the key to our different treatment of the Chinese and the Russians is very different historically determined views of each state. I mean,
really,
Russia. Our view of Russia is still descended from an British view of Russia that developed in the 1820s and 1830s, which is the way of looking at the world that also gave us our understanding of the Persians in classical mythology, but really Mordor, for those of you who read old fantasy literature, or the Empire in the revived the Star Wars franchise, right? This
Right.
very rapacious expansion, really the opposite of us. It's a Sparta to our Athens, and they were seen as diametrically opposed versions of how you constitute a good state. And
so is this like a self-fulfilling prophecy or something? Because we're describing Russia in certain terms, and then it go ahead and does it.
Well, and in this case, and I don't know, one could argue there are forces for continuity that are way beyond our ability to deal with it. But then you have to decide, well, are we going to live with these people or not? Right?
Okay.
And the other thing is, we've already benefited. You were talking about the physicists, mathematicians, engineers. There's even in southern Wisconsin, there's quite a sizable Russian diaspora community.
True.
Faculty colleagues, applied chemists in the agricultural industries and the food processing. We've already benefited from desovietization. And that's a sad thing for that country.
And do you see, as we need to probably wrap up, do you feel that which of the candidates that are running for president,
is most realistic?
What do you think of their Russian policies, so to say? Because I think most on the Democratic side, they really haven't talked about it very much. On the Republican side, it seems like the Russian diaspora seems to care for Marco Rubio. They like what he has said, or Ben Carson, apparently. So where do you stand?
I'd say that right now we're in a political environment that is not going to be very conducive to a hard-headed policy towards Russia. I think we've got to be selective. I think there are certain things where where the West has to say, look, we don't find this legitimate. You say what you will about Kosovo, the Crimea, I'm of two minds on, but the semi-war, or the strange war with Ukraine, although I've got my own opinion, I'm not sure how much control. I think one of the things going on is they've got plausible deniability on some things. I think Kadyrov is an interesting example, the leader in Chechnya.
Oh, very much so, yeah.
That he's sort of a useful guy. You don't want to control him.
I almost wonder if he's like the kind of a Rasputin person, in the sense that he's not in power, but he has this tremendous amount of influence and scared people.
I think he's a free agent that they wish he wouldn't do about 40% of what he does. But it's worth it because, this recent Instagram with Prokasyanov,
right, where he had the former prime minister in crosshairs, was showing that those that don't understand will get it now.
Yeah, exactly. So there's him. I even think these what do they call them, Opolchensi, the militia guys, quote unquote, in Donbass and Luhansk. I'm sure you were reading. There's signs that there are quite frequent frictions between them and Moscow. There's sort of a mutual hostage.
Sure, but the support is coming from Moscow, like financial support.
No question. So there, I think we got to continue expressing discontent, dissent. Middle East is a bit different, and Iran is different, and South Asia is different. And I think we got to recognize those as different spheres. They're not we don't have to be best friends with everybody. We've got shared interests in some areas. We don't have them in the other. And another thing about Russian international relations, they've never played the same game in different theaters. So
say that again.
They've never played the same game in different theaters. They've always, even if you look at the foreign ministry, you look at the pedigrees of people who are on, say, the Arab desk, like Primakov used to be, or the Chinese desk, or the American desk.
So this is the Russian officials responsible for those areas?
Well, yes, but those parts of the foreign ministry have their own sort of internal conveyor belt, internal escalator to power. It's based on having certain types of knowledge, and there will be some sort of big consensus that comes from the top, but their policies, well, the nature of diplomacy with the India, Pakistan, China triangle is very different than dealing with NATO, right? And so I don't know. I think we should have a foreign policy that's much more flexible than any candidate is willing to concede. And I think the American electorate is willing to. Right. The hard thing right now is you've got an American electorate that whatever else they want America to be great again. I know that Trump and his feeling in the United States that something's gone wrong and they don't know what. I'd be happy to tell them, but they don't listen to me. And you've got a similar electorate in Russia that whatever else, Putin is what they would call a serious man. He's not like Yeltsin was, and he's brought order. And if things are going badly, it's because of the West. And the people that don't agree with that, the people that agree with us, constitute 5 to 7% of the population, or however many it is that Yabloko and those parties can generate when they stay together long enough to run a common platform.
But to cheer themselves up, they say that the revolutions are made by few.
Yes, and the conditions.
So it's hard to say, it's hard to judge the effectiveness of this group. But if anybody's probably going to have a revolution, it's probably going to be Kadyrov more than Kasyanov.
Yeah. Oh, no question. And say going back to 1917, where we opened up, February was made possible by sort of mass ferment. November was made possible by mass ferment that February never dealt with, and but also by a much more single-minded and specific, we called ideological understanding of what power is, how do you get it, and how to use it. As Lenin used to say, who does it to whom? Who's subject, who's object, and so. We say the masses play a role. There was pretty broad, like I'd be tempted to call them 89 to 91 a revolution just because of the change of government that took place. Although everybody went bent over backwards, even Russians, to say there wasn't a revolution. But neither February nor October was as dramatic as we would like to think revolutions were, but neither was 1776.
You're listening to WSUW 91.7 FM. This is Yuri Rashkin with Rashkin Report, and my guest is David McDonald, LSD, Mortenson, Petrovich Distinguished Chair in Russian History. We're wrapping up this conversation. So, David, I'll just ask you kind of a last question. Do you think that Putin is going to leave? Is there going to be a revolution? Is there going to be a castle coup? And, of course, nobody knows 100%. But your sense?
I don't think there's going to be a revolution for a very simple reason, and I could be wrong, but I go back to 1989. I was doing research in an archive in Moscow and talking to the Nitsinyer, the cop who was the guard. And I said, and we're seeing it was the Communist People's Deputies going on. I said to him, so what do you think of all this going on? I'd gotten to know him. We were both sports fans, and he'd got me tickets for Kubek, the SSSR Cup final and that, the USSR. And I said, so what do you think of everything that's going on? And he said, well, what would you think if everything you'd been living for 80 years turned out to be a lie? I think the idea of revolution is still largely discredited or distrusted by a large part of the population. However, where I'm an optimist about revolution, which I'm not, 1917 didn't lead to the great, glorious proletarian future either. Where I'm more optimistic, or where I'm looking at social sources for possible alterations of the governing structure, you get little straws in the wind, like down the long-distance truckers and those demonstrations in Peter and Moscow the last month or so. Now, that's died out, but you're getting pensioners talking about their privileges, right? You're getting different groups in society, and you're getting people being very careful not to recreate Bolotnaya from, December 2011.
Right. And that was a protest that would coincided with Putin being returning to power as president. And those protests, that was kind of another point from which the screws have gotten tightened more and more. And during that protest in Bolotnaya Square, those people were seemingly first, I guess, who were engaged in a peaceful protest and got into criminal trouble for it.
Yes, and I think, but it was also based on this, and I'm really starting to have questions about our faith in the idea of huge social change taking place from mass mobilization, right? In these broad, sort of a brimming over of consciousness. You wonder whether, if it's going to take place. My hunch is that there's going to be, depending on how Putin leaves power or when, we'll see a protracted succession struggle among the various constituencies that have accepted him as a broker and a director, and it's going to take a generation or two yet.
David McDonald, thank you so much for your time. It's kind of almost hard to end this conversation because that makes me think of something else, but I hope that we'll be able to continue in the future. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Yuri.
Take care. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye now.
You're listening to 91.7 FM, WSUW in Whitewater, Wisconsin.